What if I told you that Trump's ultimatum to Mexico just exposed the biggest weakness in American imperial strategy? What if the threat that was supposed to force Mexico to comply instead showed the world that Washington is losing control over its own hemisphere? Let me explain exactly how this backfired in ways nobody expected. I've spent 50 years studying economic power, and I can tell you with certainty that when an empire issues public ultimatums, it's not showing strength. It's revealing weakness. Real power doesn't need to threaten anyone because it already controls the systems that matter. But when those systems start failing, when obedience is no longer automatic, that's when the desperate theater of intimidation begins. Trump's exact words aren't as important as what they revealed. This wasn't diplomacy. This wasn't negotiation. It wasn't even traditional bullying. This was a nation that had built its whole hemisphere strategy on Mexico's dependence, suddenly realizing that dependence is disappearing. And the panic in Washington isn't about Mexico being defiant. It's about Mexico finally having options after decades. Here's what nobody is telling you about this crisis. While Trump was issuing threats, something remarkable was happening in financial markets. You would expect the Mexican peso to crash under this pressure, right? That's what happened every other time over the past 50 years. But this time was different. When American capital started fleeing Mexico in fear, other money began flowing in. Asian investment funds, European banks, Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, they all saw something Trump missed: opportunity. Because here's the hidden truth about modern capitalism that Washington wants to keep quiet. When you threaten one of your most integrated economic partners, you don't hurt them first. You hurt yourself first. Every major American company operating in Mexico saw its stock prices drop immediately after Trump's ultimatum. Not because Mexico would fail, but because these companies suddenly realized their entire business depended on steady relations with a country their president was treating like an enemy. Boeing with huge factories in Mexico, Tesla with key supply chains crossing the border every day, Walmart whose profits rely on Mexican-made goods, Ford whose F-150 production partially depends on Mexican components. All of these companies watched their market value fall as Trump spoke, and that's when the real pressure began building. Because when Wall Street panics, Washington listens. But Mexico did something unexpected in that moment. Instead of backing down, instead of sending frantic diplomatic messages, instead of offering concessions, Mexico did the one thing that terrifies empires the most. Mexico said, if you want to treat us as enemies, we will explore our other options. Within 48 hours of Trump's ultimatum, Mexico's president was on calls with Beijing. Within a week, trade delegations were being arranged with Brazil, India, and Indonesia. Within 2 weeks, European Union officials were quietly flying to Mexico City to discuss expanded trade deals. This wasn't random. This was a coordinated strategy Mexico had prepared for exactly this moment. Trump and his advisors fundamentally misunderstood that we no longer live in a unipolar world. For 30 years after the Soviet collapse, the United States could threaten any country in its sphere, and that country had nowhere else to turn. If America said jump, you jumped, because there was no alternative superpower. But that world ended somewhere between 2008 and 2020. Apparently, nobody told Washington. China's economy is now big enough to take Mexico's exports. India's middle class is growing fast enough to buy Mexican products. The European Union is desperate enough for energy security to consider partnerships with Mexico. Russia, despite its challenges, still controls huge resources and has reasons to support nations challenging American power. The BRICS nations together now represent a bigger share of global GDP than the G7. What Mexico realized, and what Trump didn't, is that economic multipolarity allows you to call America's bluff. For the first time since the Mexican Revolution, Mexico had real alternatives to American economic dominance. And the moment Trump made his ultimatum, he essentially forced Mexico to prove this to the world. China responded first. Within hours of Trump's threat, Beijing issued a statement supporting Mexico's right to decide its own economic policies without outside pressure. But it wasn't just words. Chinese state banks immediately announced bigger credit facilities for Mexican infrastructure. Chinese tech companies began speeding up their Mexico investments. Chinese state-owned enterprises started serious discussions about Mexico as a North American manufacturing hub serving both both NAFTA and Asian markets. Russia followed, offering preferential energy deals and joint industrial projects. India proposed expanding digital services partnerships. Brazil suggested integrating Mexico more into South American trade networks. One by one, every major non-American economic power basically told Mexico, if the United States won't treat you as an equal, we will. And then something extraordinary happened inside Mexico itself. Public opinion polls showed something unprecedented. For the first time in modern history, a majority of citizens supported their government taking a firm stance against American pressure, even if it risked short-term economic uncertainty. Decades of dependence had created a mindset of submission. Trump's ultimatum broke that mindset overnight. Because here's what Trump unintentionally revealed. The relationship was never built on mutual respect. For generations, Mexican leaders had framed economic integration with the United States as a partnership between equals. Trump's words made it clear that from Washington's view, it was always a master-servant dynamic. Once that was undeniable, public opinion shifted sharply. Mexican business leaders who had always advised accommodating American demands began saying something new. They suggested it might be worth exploring alternatives to American dominance, even if riskier at first. Total dependence on a partner who treats you with contempt isn't security, it's delayed instability. Mexican thinkers began analyzing how historical trauma from American conquest had created a national psychology of subordination that actually limited development. Trump's ultimatum, by exposing American contempt, created space for Mexico to finally address this legacy. Mexican workers started questioning why their wages were so much lower than American wages for the same work, even when the gap was supposedly justified by partnership and fairness, was actually based on control and exploitation. As Trump's ultimatum implied, then perhaps those wages needed to be renegotiated from a position of power rather than compromise. But the real shock happened in Washington, where Trump's own Republican Party started breaking apart over this crisis. Corporate Republicans whose donors had billions tied up in Mexican operations began quietly pressuring Trump to step back. Military Republicans who knew Mexico was America's most important security partner in Latin America warned that this ultimatum was actually helping China gain influence in the Western Hemisphere. Economic Republicans calculated that a trade war with Mexico would raise inflation and hurt Trump's chances of re-election. The Pentagon released carefully worded statements highlighting the importance of the U.S.-Mexico security partnership, which everyone understood as bureaucratic resistance to Trump's ultimatum. The CIA leaked reports suggesting that pushing Mexico toward China would be disastrous for American intelligence operations in Latin America. The Treasury Department produced studies showing that a breakdown in relations with Mexico would disrupt American supply chains and increase costs for American consumers. Even Trump's most loyal advisors quietly started softening their stance on the ultimatum, suggesting it was misunderstood or didn't mean what it seemed to mean. But the damage had already been done. Trump had shown that American dominance in its own hemisphere was not as secure as Washington had long claimed. And that's when the real irony of the situation became obvious. Trump's ultimatum, meant to force Mexican submission, instead highlighted Mexican independence. It was supposed to show American power, but it revealed American weakness. It was meant to isolate Mexico, but it connected Mexico to alternative global partners. 6 months later, the results are clear. Mexico's trade with China has risen by 40%. Mexican industrial partnerships with India have grown significantly. European investment in Mexican clean energy has reached record highs. Russian-Mexican agricultural cooperation has expanded beyond expectations. Meanwhile, American companies that were supposed to gain from Trump's hardline stance are losing market share in Mexico to Chinese, European, and other competitors. American consumers are paying more for Mexican goods due to the uncertainty Trump's ultimatum created in supply chains. The peso, which was expected to collapse under American pressure, has actually strengthened against the dollar as international investors see Mexico as a stable alternative to American economic dominance in Latin America. Most importantly, Mexico discovered something it hadn't fully realized before Trump's ultimatum. It doesn't need American permission to succeed. For decades, Mexican economic policy was shaped around gaining American approval. Now, Mexican economic policy is focused on maximizing its options in a multipolar world. This is what Trump fundamentally misunderstood about power in the 21st century. Modern dominance relies on making your control appear beneficial to those under it. The moment you have to openly threaten someone, you've revealed that your relationship depends on force rather than mutual benefit. And in a world with multiple power centers, a relationship based on force becomes a weakness rather than a strength. What we're seeing is nothing less than the start of the decline of American influence in Latin America, not because Mexico is anti-American, but because Mexico has realized it has choices. Once a country sees it has options, the old psychology of dominance and submission stops working. Trump's ultimatum to Mexico may go down in history as the moment American overreach finally sparked the independence it was trying to prevent. The empire pushed, but this time the rebels had other options. But let's look closer at what this means for ordinary people. Geopolitics isn't only about governments and corporations. It's about whether people can afford food, whether jobs are secure, whether children have better opportunities than their parents. The psychological change happening in Mexico right now is unprecedented. For generations, Mexicans were told their country's success depended on American approval. Parents told kids to learn English because their future was tied to pleasing American employers. Universities shaped programs to train workers for American companies. Government policy was designed to attract American investment at any cost. Trump's ultimatum shattered this mindset overnight. Suddenly, millions of Mexicans realized that the relationship they thought was mutually beneficial was actually based on submission. And once you see dominance clearly, you can't unsee it. Once you understand that your hardships are not your fault, but the result of a deliberately structured system, everything changes. Mexican workers started asking new questions. If American companies made billions from Mexican labor while paying low wages, why should Mexicans be grateful? If the United States used its economic power to keep Mexican wages low, why prioritize American interests over Mexican prosperity? Mexican entrepreneurs began exploring new markets. Why focus only on American consumers when Chinese and Indian markets are growing faster? Why accept American technology deals when Chinese and European companies offer better terms? Mexican students started learning Mandarin alongside English. Mexican universities built partnerships with Chinese and Indian institutions. Mexican researchers joined international scientific projects. The whole intellectual focus of Mexican society shifted from north-south to genuinely global. This shift alarmed Washington because it revealed something American strategists had denied for decades. American influence in Latin America relied more on Latin American psychology than military power. The United States maintained control not mainly through force, but by convincing Latin American societies there was no alternative to American integration. Once that psychological control broke, the material foundations of American dominance began collapsing quickly. Mexican state governments started direct ties with Chinese provinces, bypassing federal bureaucracies. Mexican companies started using Chinese banks instead of American ones. Infrastructure projects began using Chinese technology standards rather than American ones. The American business world watched in disbelief as decades of carefully built economic relationships unraveled, not because Mexico was acting irrationally or anti-American, but because it was finally pursuing its own interests instead of bending to American preferences. And the bitter irony for American workers is that Trump's ultimatum ended up hurting them the most. American companies built on cheap Mexican labor suddenly faced uncertainty across their supply chains. American consumers faced higher prices as companies sought more costly alternatives. American exporters lost market share in Mexico as businesses diversified toward non-American suppliers. The crisis revealed a truth about modern capitalism many overlook. Interdependence creates shared vulnerability. When the United States relied on Mexican production for its wealth, it also became vulnerable to Mexican independence. The same globalization that let American companies exploit Mexican workers gave those workers leverage over American firms. Trump thought he could use America's economic power to force Mexican submission, but he found out that instead, it became clear that America's economic power depended on Mexico's cooperation. The threat backfired because it exposed the difference between dominance and reliance, between strength and weakness, between imperial control and imperial overreach. What we are seeing now is the early phase of a complete reshaping of power relations in the Western Hemisphere. Mexico is not just expanding its economic partnerships. It is reclaiming its historical independence. Other Latin American countries are watching this process carefully and starting to ask themselves whether they too have more options than they realized. Colombia is exploring closer ties with China and India. Brazil is positioning itself as a leader of economic cooperation across the global south. Argentina is rethinking its traditional focus on American and European markets. Chile is using its mineral resources to form partnerships across Asia and Africa. Ecuador is leveraging its oil wealth to lessen its reliance on American financial institutions. This isn't driven by anti-American sentiment. It is simple, rational calculation. In a multipolar world, countries that diversify their partnerships are safer and more prosperous than those that remain dependent on one dominant power. Trump's ultimatum to Mexico essentially forced every Latin American government to acknowledge this reality. The long-term consequences are enormous. For 75 years, the United States treated Latin America as its exclusive economic zone, its captive market, its reliable source of cheap labor and raw materials. That era is ending, not because of ideology or resentment, but because the global economy now gives Latin American countries real alternatives to American economic dominance. China needs Latin American agricultural goods and mineral resources. India needs Latin American energy cooperation and manufacturing partnerships. Europe needs Latin American support in climate action and renewable energy development. Russia seeks Latin American strategic partnerships to counter American pressure. The Middle East looks to Latin America as a market for its accumulated petrodollars. For the first time since the early 19th century, Latin American countries have multiple great powers competing for their partnership instead of one hegemonic power demanding their obedience. Trump's ultimatum to Mexico unintentionally announced to the world that the United States no longer felt confident enough in its dominance over the hemisphere to maintain it through soft power alone. And that announcement triggered exactly the response Washington feared most. Latin American countries are beginning to explore what independence looks like in the 21st century. Not romantic revolutionary independence, but practical economic independence based on diversified partnerships and true strategic autonomy. The Mexico that emerges from this crisis will be fundamentally different from the Mexico that entered it. Not necessarily anti-American, but no longer automatically pro-American. Not necessarily opposed to American business, but no longer willing to place Mexican interests beneath American priorities. Not necessarily aligned with China against the United States, but willing to cooperate with China when it benefits Mexico. This is the new reality Trump's ultimatum has created. A Mexico that acts like an independent country rather than an American protectorate. And once this precedent is set, every other Latin American country will have to decide whether it wants to stay in a dependent relationship with Washington or explore the possibilities of real sovereignty in a multipolar world. The empire's ultimatum backfired because it revealed that the empire no longer had the power to make ultimatums work. And in geopolitics, perception often becomes reality faster than anyone expects.